观众朋友们好，感谢大家来到本期的思想先驱报节目现场。今天呢，我们继续为大家谈跟这个金砖几国有关的消息。现在说金砖几国的时候都要停顿一下，因为不知道过几天到底是4国、5国、6国、7国、22国还是40国啊。现在整个金砖集团成为整个世界新闻瞩目的焦点。而在金砖峰会上出现了各国之间比较微妙的角力斗争也成为了我们特别关注到的要点。金砖几国到底是如何而来呢？其实这本身是投资界的一个概念。在2011年的时候，高盛的一个银行家叫做吉姆·奥尼尔，由他首次创建金砖4国 BRIC 这样的一个缩写，指的是巴西、印度、俄罗斯和中国。那么当时奥尼尔预计这4个国家会对全球的经济产生重大的影响。在2006年的时候，高盛正式成立了一个叫做金砖4国投资基金。那么这个基金呢，大体设计的理念就是与这4个国家的经济增长挂钩。那我们也知道，21世纪第1个10年正好是整个全球对于发展中国家或者叫做新兴大国觉得十分兴奋的时候，特别是在整个全球金融危机之后的几年。在2009年4国领导人首次举行了以金砖4国署名的峰会。那么金砖4国从此之后就成为了一个半正式意义上的政治集团，而在之后南非加入了。其实金砖集团或者叫做金砖国家作为一个政治上的一个联盟组织，从成立之时就面临很多的质疑。如果大家回看当时的媒体报道，很多媒体的分析人士都认为建立这样的一个组织根本就没有道理。我们还记得《金融时报》的一位评论家叫做菲利普·史蒂文斯，他在2011年的时候就写了一篇文章，说是时候与金砖国家说再见了。说金砖国家这个砖根本就没有泥浆，言外之意就是只是空有其名，并没有一个具体的现实的政治意涵。而《金融时报》的另外一位专栏作家马丁·沃尔夫则表示，金砖国家不属于任何一个集团，其成员是杂盘军奇怪的组合，随机不相干的4方，没有任何共同之处。而说到高盛，在2015年的时候高盛也最终做出了决定，关闭金砖基金，原因是这个基金回报率是比较低的。其实金砖国家的成员国从成立之时就有很多的分歧，内部也出现各种各样的争议。比如巴西和俄罗斯是大宗商品的出口国，而中国是大宗商品的进口国，正好处在国际贸易利益的两方。巴西、印度和南非都算是民主国家，而中国和俄罗斯是专制政权。巴西和南非是无核国家，中国、印度和俄罗斯都有核武器。也许金砖5国中最严重的一对矛盾就是中国和印度面临的持续的边界冲突。我们很少说一个稳固的政治集团里面这一些国家还在边境领土这样的问题上不断的打架。但是尽管存在各种各样的分歧，金砖国家的这样的一个年度峰会却是一年一年的组织起来了。现在回头看，大家可能对于金砖国家的命运最开始的这个死刑判决是过于悲观了。金砖集团的外交和经济关系没有解体，其实在过去几年还得到了加强。即使是出现了重大领导人的换届转变，比如莫迪在2014年上台，2018年巴西的极右民粹主义的领导人博索纳罗的当选等等等等，似乎也没有导致整个金砖国家的彻底的瓦解。这与美国总统这个川普当选了之后退出了一系列国际组织，似乎是形成了某一种对比今天我们着重要为大家介绍到的是来自《外交政策》杂志的2篇文章，对于金砖国家的历史变迁以及这一次金砖峰会可能取得的成果进行了详细的分析。今年8月，金砖峰会在约翰内斯堡举行，这已经是这个集团的第15次峰会了。现在分歧最大的问题就是集团是不是要扩大成员国。另外有一个重大的瞩目焦点，就是中国不断上升的影响力。也有这样的一种担心，就是未来金砖集团可能会成为以中国领导的某一个势力范围的代言。那我们也知道，金砖几国之间有很多的分歧和紧张关系，从成立之始就没有断过。但是来自外交政策的评论分析也认为，这一些国家的共同点和可能的利益寻求点， 往往比西方的分析者理解的要多得多。如果金砖国家可以构建某一些可以说是在西方之外的国家之间的某一种共赢的利益的这样的一个典范，那么可能带来的战略成果比成本可能还要高。首先一点也应该明确，就是金砖集团不要认为这个集团是铁板一块，内部的矛盾和分歧可能会现在存在，未来也长期存在。那么应该怎样看待金砖国家现在出现凝聚化的趋势呢？作者认为，这是世界很多的国家对于美国主导的单极主义持一种怀疑态度的表现。金砖国家不管其中他们自己有怎样的问题，普遍认为在与西方国家谈判时，如果发展中国家和第三世界的共同利益主体能够形成某一种战略自主性，能够形成某一种讨价还价的能力，那么可能对于彼此都是有好处的。正如印度外长此前在开幕致辞中所说的，太多的国家任由太少的国家摆布了，指的是现在整个全球政治实力的不平衡。那我就要请教和平先生印度的这一位外长讲的这一点有没有道理？就是说，我们这个金砖集团并不是自己内部要形成某一条战线，而是现在在整个国际社会上，特别是政治问题上的话语权是由太少的国家所摆布的。而金砖国家可以说是以发展中国家的领头羊为代表，应该形成某一种讨价还价的权益。而这样的一种讨价还价的实力，至少在我们有这样的一个共同联盟的时候，可能会更加得到加强。
我认为他讲的非常有道理，这也是金砖五国的背景，这也是当时候的不结盟运动的一个背景。因为西方这开始启动了工业的革命，在战争中间，无论是在欧洲战场还是在亚洲战场，西方都是扮演了一个绝对主导性的这么一个角色。那么这种角色很自然让这个西方，特别就是美国的话语权呢越来越大。全世界把美国看成是一个灯塔。美国在全世界通过它的电影，通过它的军事行动，通过它的经济，通过它的外交，表现出一个实际上不仅是一个世界的警察，维护世界的安全体系，同时也是以美国的标准衡量和要求各个国家的发展的模式。如果不符合美国的价值观，不符合美国的利益，那么这些国家就有可能会被排斥、冷落，甚至严重的还会被制裁会被打击。美国的这样一种强势的作风，在这个冷战后期，尤其是新技术革命，美国又扮演了一个主导性的角色，再加上美元、美军价值体系很多因素混合在一起，实际上这个世界严格意义上是在美国当家。但是随着全球化的这样一种深化，很多的国家也发现自己有了话语权的一个基础，就是有了市场，有了这个经济崛起的这个实力。像印度有强大的这样一个人口市场，一个强大的一个技术的力量一个经济的力量甚至他认为他有哲学的思想。而中国变成一个制造业的大国，又变成一个消费的这个大国这些因素使他们感觉到了完全要听美国的不行完全听美国的不行。不是说每个国家听美国就一定成功，很多南美国家，很多的中东国家也听美国的，也不是说一定像有些人说的这个当年小平到这个美国就讲一句话，说这个世界上谁跟美国走谁就发达了这种见解可见当时候假如是真的话可见当时候的中国的这个认知对世界的认知还是太单薄了一点。那么这是一个大的背景，正是因为有这个大的背景，才出现了金砖五国当然经济上是一个很重要的一个因素，实际上在外交上这些国家想扮演一个西方不同的一个声音。事实上金砖五国也发挥了这些作用，并不是说完全没有发挥作用那么西方原来所预期的金砖五国完全要分裂，要分崩离析，也未必产生了。只是说如果金砖五国是按照一个反美的这么一个阵营的经历，我觉得不仅是不现实的，同时也做不到。
好，谢谢和平先生 那么我们就要谈到这一次金砖峰会上分歧最大的一个问题，就是到底要不要变成金砖5国家啊？是不是要继续扩大成员国？这个争议点到底在哪儿呢？有观察者说呀，这可能是金砖国家、金砖集团成立14年以来面临的最大的分歧。其中的一方面呢，利益代表是中国。中国呀，不希望这个集团变成一个排他性的集团，一直啊是希望整合更多的成员进来，整合的成员更多，这个由中国主导的联盟实力就最强。因此，中国其实是在2017年正式提出了所谓金砖加这样的一个概念。什么叫做金砖加呢？就是在给这个成员正式资格之前呢，我先给你一个预备成员啊，有一点类似于观察国这样的一个机制啊，像欧盟观察国。结果呢，通过这样的一个吸引机制，能够拉近各国与金砖5国的关系，拉近与金砖国家的关系，其实就是拉近与中国的关系。那么同时呢，中国政府在这个财政贷款上也给了金砖国家各种各样的福利，包括呢，他们本国可以入股上海合作组织等等这样的一些福利。那么从这个俄罗斯的角度而言啊，俄罗斯也希望能够扩大金砖国家的联盟。这一点上，为什么中俄利益一致呢？因为俄罗斯认为这呀有助于建立一个对俄罗斯不那么反对的一个国家集团，以对抗西方现在对于俄罗斯这样一个孤立的企图，成为这个俄罗斯自己的某一种大后方啊，或者至少是一个外交上的缓冲地带，这也符合俄罗斯的利益。反过来而言，巴西和印度可就不这么乐观了，他们一直是非常谨慎地看待金砖扩容这样的一个理念或者是变化。因为巴西和印度，他们更希望从一个比较小的或者是一个比较集中的这样的一个俱乐部中获得利益。如果整个俱乐部越扩越大，那变成另外一个不结盟组织，变成一个这个整个的这个联合国非盟了，那么对于他们而言所得的利益就会比较小。而巴西和印度也担心把在金砖集团内部的影响力拱手让给中国和俄罗斯，导致自己的相对影响力下降。而在巴西和印度看来，之所以中国希望扩容，这主要是希望让新成员的加入更符合中国政府的利益，让整个金砖国家的立场更变得以中国为中心。因此，现在呀，不管是巴西的相关政策评论人士，还是印度的外交官，都认为金砖国家是一个品牌和资产。现在我们不应该让这个品牌和资产进一步出现淡化。那我们也知道金砖国家扩员进程现在呢，其实也在讨论之中。这一次峰会召开，能不能够达成一些国家进来也不知道。但是潜在的一些新的成员国是谁呢？比如孟加拉国，比如埃及、阿拉伯联合酋长国、乌拉圭等等等等。除了扩容之外还有另外一个重要的看点，就是未来金砖国家的贷款是不是要以成员国的货币，而不是美元提供。理论上而言，如果按照现在整个金砖的组成规章那么每一个成员都会对集团的重大决定有否决权。这也就解释了为什么每一年金砖峰会的宣言都什么都没说，因为里面要太明确的表态呢，可能有一个国家不同意这个峰会。
其实简单的说就是这次会议之前的峰会几乎只有开不开的没什么意义。
对，就是这样的一个概念每次说的都是一些大家都认为正确的废话
对，
因为呢，一旦要说出一些立场明确的话，有一个集团不同意，那就没有办法了。
对，
在这整个的这个我们就说金砖国家的实践中这个成员国呢也并不完全是地位平等，尽管在否决权上是完全平等的。中国自己一国的国内生产总值就占到了其他所有成员国的总和，因此也有人说这个金砖国家说白了里面是有这个叫做非正式的种族隔离和等级制度的显然中国占主导。那么中国占主导扩容呢，也希望增强非洲大陆的参与。那么为什么这样？大家心里也很明白，这是因为整个非洲与中国的这样的一个利益的牵缠不管是在贷款上、在金钱上，还是在政治利益上。后来这个印度、巴西和南非的这个三方机制 IBSA 也在金砖国家体系不断稳定之后变得废除了。那么如果说南非加入金砖5国的一个长期的副作用，就是削弱了印度、巴西和南方的这样的一个三方机制。那么现在北京是不是已经成功的建立了一个以中国利益为核心的全球未来呢？可能也是这3国最担心的一点。但是尽管巴西对于扩容十分的反对，印度其实心里也是在打鼓。 但是中国和俄罗斯仍然是强力推荐啊，那么希望更多的国家可以加入到整个金砖体系中。特别是卢拉最近呢，在一次发言中似乎是脱稿说出了这样的一句话，说支持邀请委内瑞拉加入金砖5国。这不但让这个其他的国家觉得掉了眼镜，连巴西自己的顾问也觉得，好像卢拉在这个场合说的话似乎不太符合巴西的利益。还有几个潜在的候选国，比如说像伊朗叙利亚呀，包括我们刚才提到的委内瑞拉，他们近来还有另外一重担忧，就是他们这个反西方的这样的一个色彩太过于明确。如果北京和莫斯科已经占到了主导，现在再把伊朗、叙利亚拉进来，那是不是这样的一个国家就变成了一个以这个反西方阵营为核心宗旨的一个集团国家？这就会让巴西和印度这样的一些民主国家与西方也维持某一种良性关系的国家觉得比较的不舒服，不愿意让这个金砖国家带上太多的反美反西方这样的色彩。这正是刚才何明先生所强调的金砖国家的危险所在。那么来自外交政策的这一篇文章也分析到，如果说金砖国家从2009年成立以来取得了成功的话，其实它最大的一个成功是在内部矛盾分歧重重的情况下，仍然是维持了某一种团结和对外的力量，把重点放在统一的主题上，比如世界秩序更加多极化，比如加强南南关系等等等等。印度和中国的关系可以说是出了名的复杂和紧张，尽管新德里一直帮助莫斯科出口石油，印度也一直在有计划的寻求减少对于俄罗斯的武器依赖。现在也是俄罗斯买武器和欧洲同时也买武器。就在这样的一个非常复杂多元的这样的一个情况下金砖国家还能不暴露裂痕，还能够达到某一种基本上的团结，这也的确让人觉得不得不竖起大拇指。而长期以来俄罗斯一直在试图改变金砖国家的属性，希望把它变成一个亲俄亲中反西方的集团。巴西和印度一直努力阻止这样做。现在其实有关于金砖国家最危险的矛盾，正是在这两方的势力牵扯之中。换句话说，不是金砖国家的内部分歧现在已经到了吵到了要掀开房顶的时刻，其实西方始终是房子里面的大象，特别是如何处理与美国的关系。之前这一次金砖峰会之前，大家特别关注到的是南非作为罗马规约的缔约国，如果普京出席会议，是不是会对他进行逮捕？那么根据来自外交政策这一篇文章的分析，实际上南非政府内部也一直在讨论到底怎样处理这样的一个微妙的问题，既不能逮捕他，也不能不逮捕他。如果普京真的来到这个南非的话，最后这个问题呢变成了是一个没有问题的问题，因为普京决定不出席。其实普京不出席我估计南非这一方也是长长的松了一口气，避免了一次麻烦。但是根据这个来自外交政策的分析，现在南非其实也有实际的代价，因为南非这样的选择其实已经与他和美国和欧洲的关系产生了一些负面的影响。南非在俄罗斯入侵乌克兰之后，其实是与莫斯科走得更近，包括媒体报道向莫斯科提供武器等等。现在七国集团也是拒绝邀请南非作为嘉宾参加最近的一次峰会。据来自外交政策这一篇文章的统计，这还是现任总统拉马福萨从2018年以来上任的第一次。除非俄乌战争很快结束，否则未来巴西和印度也有可能会面临这样的选择。来自这个外交政策这一篇文章说，如果我们看到这一次峰会上完全就把它理解成为是一个宣布接纳新成员或者是拒绝接纳新成员一个地缘政治活动，那么可能就把金砖集团的实力象征理解过于简单化了。现在我们看到金砖4国、金砖5国以及整个金砖势力的崛起，与其说它反映的是这样一个集团自己的内部需求，不如说它反映的是对于美国长期主导的单极秩序的某一种对冲或者是制约。核心还是我们刚才说的这一句话：美国问题以及美国现在长期对于整个世界的主导以及国际政治话语权的分配不平均，可能是我们理解这一次金砖峰会真正需要了解到的一点。 与其说是北京和莫斯科与巴西和印度争夺主导权，不如说是这一些国家在面对西方的时候所呈现的多元的态度，导致了这个国家内部更多的复杂关系。那么有关于外交政策的这一篇文章可以说对于整个金砖国家的历史、金砖国家内部的复杂性、金砖国家中的势力纷争以及与西方的关系进行了一个概括性的论述。那我想请问一下何明先生，你认为这一次金砖峰会可能会产生什么具体可交付的结果吗？那么现在美国和西方看到金砖峰会召开，又会有什么样的想法呢？
这个习近平主席或者习近平先生呢，没有能够出席一下活动，又出席一下活动引起我们对他的健康的一个特别的这个担心。因为任何国家的领袖的健康，实际上对这个国家的政治是有非常大的影响。美国现在的总统关心拜登先生我们最关心的就是他的身体的健康。如果身体健康真的是这种证明不行，那明年的选举的整个的政治生态就会产生一个变化。对于习近平他上台之后，大家对他的议论非常之多，现在批评怨恨也非常之多。但是要改变中国现在的政治生态，其中一个最微妙的一个指标就是习近平的身体。如果习近平的身体就像我们现在表面所看到的，后面确实是隐藏的一些问题，甚至还不能出席这个活动呢，那你当然对于中国的政治甚至世界的政治都会产生非常大的影响。其实这个事情其实已经超过了金砖五国的重要的意义。但是如果只是一些疲劳，或者说还有更复杂的原因，那就反映了金砖五国内部现在产生的冲突可能比我们严重想象的要严重。因为我在这个华尔街论坛的时候，我特别讲到了要防止对于金砖五国来讲又变成一个的77国集团人很多每一次开会很热闹，但是真正能够做出有实质性的行动和共识，其实是非常之难的。那过去的这些金砖峰会其实就反映出来，大家要统一起来行动是很不容易。我们平常讲到机器会议，西方七国越来越没有力量越来越做出一些比较空洞的一些事情。其实搞一个组织形成一个力量，对于金砖五国来讲，难度比这个机器还要大很多很多。那么这一次的这个纷争前面李奇博士介绍这个外交政策的这个文章里面讲了，中国占的这个比例非常之大主要就是有钱有钱就是老大你搞社团组织，你很清楚你想成立一个这个广西同乡会你这个会长首先能够请大家吃饭，你只有请得起大家吃饭，你才有可能当会长很少会说你有能力或者是你的品质很好那当然也是考虑的因素之一，但是主要还是你请得起大家吃饭。那中国有这个能力，虽然现在经济不那么好，但是比其他国家的实力还是不太一样，所以中国在这个里面的角色是一个决定性的。虽然有印度和巴西的牵制，但是这台戏确实还是在习近平唱。习近平自己要想清楚。从昨天的一些讲话的内容看呢，我觉得就是怨恨多了一点比如说讲什么国家你只要领先就会被挨打，什么国家产生某些竞争力你就要把它干掉这是非常明确的直接指责这个美国虽然没有点名这个等情绪我认为是比较危险的这种危险就在于呢，你会把金砖五国带入到一个真正的现实的一个反美国的阵营，这就是一个危险，因为别的国家未必一定这么干，而且呢，你会把这个事情又变成了一批呢穷朋友、小朋友、黑朋友的一个丐帮游戏这个就非常不好。但是呢，这样一个场合，谁也不想离开你说已经进来了，印度意见很大，对吧？我当不了旗手，你中国当旗手，然后我就退出来吗？那对于印度来讲也是一个问题，巴西来讲也是一个问题。所以我觉得这一阵如果他们是一个比较的理性的这个和缓的一个共识的话呢，其实还是应该的这个限制新的会员参加那么呢让这个加入会员成为一等责任，也成为一等特别的荣耀，而其他人呢可以作为观察员，或者呢 你甚至也可以不定期的邀请，比如说这一次的会议在南非开啊，南非的各国朋友就来得多一点，30个国家参加。下一次在巴西开，这个美洲的各个国家邀请的就会多一点，对吧？再邀请一些观察员。机器会议的一个好处就是它具有某一种弹性的空间，它不太扩展新的会员一度只有俄罗斯加入了。但是呢，每一年或者每一次邀请的不同的国家来，就成了为自己的这个利益或者自己的价值找到了一个比较的迂回的一种做法。所以这一次的会议如果在这方面不是筑起一个反美的旗帜，而是呢更多的强调在合作中间的一个共同的发展。还是要回到最基本的经济面来才能来减少这个冲突才能呢有一些具体的合作。至于在美元货币方面这个就是非常复杂的一个体系，不是通过这么一个会就能够达到多少具体的成果，因为每个国家与每个国家的货币政策、财经情况不大一样，这个要慢慢谈。但是这一次确实反映了这些国家对美国的制裁的这样一种恐惧这样一种或者反弹那么如果他把这样一种方式变得比较缓和一点给自己一些迂回空间的话呢我觉得可能是最理性的结果当然他们现在还在吵架吵架看吵到什么程度这可能是习近平的没有出现一些活动的更本质的原因。
好，谢谢何明先生的点评那么同时我们也特别注意到一个有趣的细节。那么昨天呢，习近平来到了约翰内斯堡，受到了南非总统的热情接待那么两个人呢有这样的一个环节共同去参观南非一处的历史古迹在看到这样的一个像石头似的这样的一个历史文物的时候习近平也留下了一句话，他到底是怎么说的？我们请导播把这一段视频带声音播出。
好 ，Good morning，
早上好。
很高兴再次见到你。希望昨天晚上休息得好。
休息得非常好。
I had a great sleep.
Wonderful. Very happy.
今天天气非常好。
Such wonderful sunshine.
Yes, yes.
非常好。
This is the beginning of our summer.
这是开始要到夏季了。
We've just come out of a very cold winter.
之前是冬季刚刚过去。
所以你们现在气候很好。
So such lovely weather.
Yes. Now I should tell you about this.
跟您介绍一下这块石头。
This symbolizes the march of 20,000 women during apartheid who came to the Union Building.
在种族隔离时期，有2万妇女，她们呢游行一直到这个联邦大厦。这块石头呢是记录这个历史事件。
They were being forced to carry passes, reference books, and they refused, and they marched to this building, and the Prime Minister ran away.
当时的法律来说呢，这些妇女呢，她们要在大街上走呢，是必须要有专门的通行证的。她们拒绝这么做，那么集体游行到这儿，当时的总理呢就逃跑了。
So they then said, the women of South Africa are the rock, and they were crying apartheid. So this is what it symbolizes.
之后就留下了一个传说，就是南非的妇女呢，她们就像岩石一样坚硬，她们会把种族隔离制度给碾碎。这个石头就是记录这个。
So we remember the women of South Africa.
所以我们把它放在这儿来纪念并嘉奖。
还有象征意义。
Great symbolism.
It's a great symbolism.
中国也有个谚语叫做“只要功夫深，铁杵磨成针”。
In Chinese, we have a saying that if you apply much work, then a rock can become a needle.
There you are. Thank you.
我们看到习近平说了一句中国有一句谚语，只要功夫深，铁杵磨成针。那我们看地上那还是个球离磨成针还有很远，看来还需要再下功夫。其实有很多这个发展中国家的发展也是这样的并不是说是这个想建立一个反西方的阵营与美国抗衡，这个1年2年未来5年10年就能够实现的。发展的道路仍然是艰巨而漫长的。在谈及中国近期的经济问题的时候大家也特别找到了习近平以前曾经有过的这样的一段演讲，讲到中国是汪洋大海，不是一个小池塘小池塘出现风浪但是大海就不一样。这段视频我们不知道导播能不能够找到，如果有的话呢，也可以给我们的观众朋友们进行播出。在明天的思想先驱报中我们继续回来谈中国的经济问题。 中国这一次能不能够铁杵磨成针呢？到底能不能够经历住时间的考验啊？这个小池塘和汪洋大海，中国到底是池塘多一些，还是汪洋大海多一些？是不是这一次也会被风暴掀翻啊？我们不知道。习近平当时说说大海既有风平浪静的时候，有的时候呢也会有狂风暴雨。现在中国是不是处于狂风骤雨之际呢？习近平当时在做这样的一个点评的时候说没有狂风骤雨那就不是大海了啊，只有狂风骤雨，大海可以承受住，小池塘可能就被掀翻了。他到底会不会被掀翻呢？他的身体情况是不是会在明天的这个时候有更一步清晰的消息？这都是明天我们会继续为您整理并且更新的内容。感谢给我们打赏的观众朋友们，感谢麦团，感谢艺人，感谢如是我们。谢谢这些观众朋友们对于我们的支持。明天同一时间，思想先驱报与您再会。
What is the state of U.S. policy towards China? What are they trying to achieve?
Well, that's a good question. One of the only things that the Trump and Biden administrations have agreed on is that the US is, in different ways, too commercially exposed to China. That resulted in something called decoupling, sometimes under the Trump administration and former US trade representative Robert Lighthizer. It's always meant something around securing American supply chains against China. It started particularly in 2018 with lots of noise and fanfare with those extensive tariffs on a very large share of US imports from China. More recently, you've heard a lot about de-risking the economy rather than decoupling, diversifying supply chains, concepts like reshoring production, bringing things that are made in China back to the US, friendshoring, which has meant bringing production out of China and to countries that America finds more reliable, and some element of self-sufficiency on national security grounds. But it's been a big blend of different priorities from the two different administrations, all sort of bundled together under those decoupling and de-risking words.
It was hard to miss the pivot to a more antagonistic US-China policy under President Trump. But to an extent, some of that is continuing under Biden, although perhaps with a bit less fanfare.
Yeah, I think it's often missed out that obviously all of those Trump tariffs, they remain in place. So it's best to think of Biden's policies towards China as stacked on top of the ones which were largely already brought in during the Trump administration. The current administration has actually expanded to focusing on export controls of very sensitive technologies and foreign investment restrictions, both from the US to China and from China to the US. The latest of those arrived on August the 9th, which was an executive order introducing screening for outbound investment and banning some investment into Chinese quantum computing and artificial intelligence projects, as well as very advanced semiconductor chips. America wants to weaken China's grip on sensitive industries, and in a motivation that largely goes unspoken to prepare for a possible invasion of Taiwan by the People's Republic of China. So there's been a sort of expansion of the policies against China under Biden, but with probably substantially less noise.
And on the face of it, it looks like those policies are working, right? Bilateral trade between the US and China seems to have dropped precipitously.
Yeah, absolutely. If you look as recently as 2018, when those tariffs came in, the Trump tariffs, about 2/3 of American imports from a group of low-cost Asian countries came from China. Last year, just over half did. In global trade terms, that's a really significant drop. Investment flows have adjusted, if anything, even more rapidly. In 2016, Chinese firms invested $48 billion in America. 6 years on, that figure has shrunk to about $3 billion. For the first time in a quarter of a century, China is no longer one of the top 3 investment destinations for most members of the American Chamber of Commerce in China, which I think shows just how bad things are going. Compare that to most of the last couple of decades when China was really claiming the lion's share of new investment projects in Asia. Last year, it received less than India or Vietnam. That's from a number of countries, not just America. And instead, America's turning towards India, Mexico, and Southeast Asia in particular, countries like Vietnam and Thailand, to try and fill some of the role that previously China was playing in American supply chains.
So, I mean, that all sounds a bit like an advert for US policymaking working kind of exactly as it was intended to. But I suppose it'd be a very short episode today if that were the case. So what do you think is really going on behind the scenes here, Mike?
No, that's it. That's the end. It's August. So if you want to clock off, go to the beach now for the afternoon, go ahead. No, sadly, we should be so lucky. Instead of being slashed, trade links between China and America are enduring, but in considerably more tangled forms. There's basically, I think, three ways of looking at this. There's the most egregious, which is transshipment, which is essentially the pure rebadging of Chinese goods as coming from another country. Another country imports something from China, it's then re-exported and it's counted as an export from somewhere else. There's a good example of this late last year when the Department of Commerce found that quite a lot of Vietnamese solar panel exports were really overwhelmingly Chinese content. The second variety of entanglement comes from what are known as intermediate goods. So when a company is manufacturing something, they need to get their inputs, their raw materials, et cetera, from somewhere. So if you look at sectors like electric vehicles and electronics, where there's a big growth of those industries in places like Southeast Asia and Mexico, a lot of the parts that go into those final products actually still come from China. And in many cases, the relationship is getting considerably stronger there as those countries are exporting far more of those products to the US. And in the final, most difficult form of entanglement, you have things like critical minerals and rare earths. For example, there are minerals called gallium and germanium that are used in semiconductor production. And China processes the vast majority of those. So in the most difficult circumstances, Chinese companies provide something that is very, very difficult to find anywhere else in the world. And just because they're going through a third country to be turned into a sort of final good doesn't mean really that the US is any less exposed to Chinese participation in those very long supply chains.
So in general, rather than America having cut China out of its supply chain, it's just sort of added more players in various intermediate steps.
That certainly seems to be happening. You don't have to take our word for it. There is some evidence for all of this. I spoke with Caroline Freund. She's Dean of the UC San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy. And earlier this year, she published, along with her co-authors, some research into this unfolding dynamic. Caroline, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So in the aggregate, Chinese trade with the US has fallen. That's been taken as sort of evidence of decoupling. Investment between the two has sort of absolutely collapsed. Does that represent decoupling in your view? Is this a sign of the strategy working?
There's some evidence of it working. So proportionately, China's share of US imports have fallen since 2017 from about 22% to 16% in 2022, which is a huge decline in a short period of time. But in some sense, trade is still connected, even in those areas where imports have been reduced, because the countries that U.S. is increasingly importing from actually import more from China and are very connected to Chinese supply chains. So in some sense, there's decoupling, but there's also more opacity in trade.
So you wrote a paper recently with co-authors at the World Bank and the IMF on precisely this sort of topic. What was the conclusion of that? What did you look at? What did you find?
Yeah, so we looked at very detailed U.S. import data, and we looked first at the products with tariffs. So there's much sharper declines in Chinese exports to the U.S. in the products that the U.S. has tariffs on. There's also sharper declines in so-called strategic goods. These are advanced technology products that are identified by the U.S., and they're things like semiconductors or chemicals. So there's even sharper declines in those products. But in precisely the products that there are bigger declines, we also see that the countries that are expanding their exports to the U.S. are more integrated in supply chains with China in those precise industries, and also importing more of the exact products that they're exporting more of to the US. And that's actually especially true in the strategic products.
So it's in exactly the sectors where the Biden administration wants to reduce risk that the supply chain ties with China are actually increasing.
Yeah, that's exactly correct. So we do see that it's in the strategic industries where connection to supply chains in China and increases in imports from China driving exports from those countries to the U.S.
What does this mean for the concept of friendshoring? That's something the US administration has been keen to encourage. Does this sort of trend pose a significant problem for that as a strategy?
Not necessarily, because it could be the case that initially those countries get imported intermediates or mainly the products and just do some limited assembly and send to the US, but they learn something and over time the value added in those countries increases. So I do think that countries, Vietnam, Taiwan, India, Korea, Mexico, Canada, these countries have benefited significantly from the decoupling from China. It's just there's this additional effect of supply chains, which I don't think should be overlooked. And we learned during COVID that not knowing your suppliers a few stages away could have devastating consequences because of parts and components you couldn't get because your supplier couldn't get something. And I think we're, in some sense, lengthening supply chains, not shortening them with some of these policies. And ultimately, if this policy is going to succeed on the security side and sufficiency side, you'd need to go down all the different layers of production.
So given all of that, how can you get the sort of outcomes that the US wants, whether it's in de-risking in certain areas or broader decoupling from China? Can you get those outcomes at all? Is there something that could be done that isn't being done at the moment, given what we think are the sort of issues with the policy as it stands?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there are carrots and there are sticks. So we're definitely pulling out the stick with respect to China, but we could be pulling out a lot more carrots with respect to other trade partners. This is effectively what the TPP and now CPTPP, the Comprehensive Trans-Pacific Partnership, was all about liberalizing with other partners to set the rules of trade, to expand integration with nations we're friendly with. Now, to do that, we also have to offer some carrots, which are typically market access. And for some reason, the government's been hesitant to do that. So I think we could be doing a lot more. Instead of industrial policy and focusing on producing things at home, we could be focusing on creating really efficient economic supply chains with countries that we don't face the same kind of risks that we face with China.
That's really interesting. So there's a way in which security goals with regard to China specifically would be easier to achieve if the last 7 years or so of American withdrawal from these multilateral trade deals hadn't happened. Then it would be easier to get other Asian economies on side as far as supply chains go from within the framework of something like CPTPP.
Yeah, I mean, you'd be giving other countries market access to the U.S. economy, which is a huge consumer market, in exchange for access to their markets, which would be good for U.S. producers. And with that, you also buy trust and cooperation in other areas such as security or the environment. And I think as well, it doesn't do any harm. So if we take a step back and we say, is decoupling even what we should be doing? It depends how risky we think China is becoming, and whether we want to just be very careful about a small number of really strategic products, the kind of small gardens, high fence approach, or whether we want to really broadly decouple. And I don't think there's been enough discussion about that, as well as while we're doing that, let's also do things that are good no matter what, and integrating more with our friends so that goods are produced most efficiently and resources are used most efficiently is a win-win no matter what, as well as creating more cooperation on other areas that we care about.
Caroline, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, Tom, Alice, I found that point from Caroline on the US participation in multilateral trade deals really interesting. And I think for me, that's one of the things that comes up most often when you talk to Asian businesses and Asian policymakers, essentially that the US is not a particularly reliable partner on trade and hasn't been for quite a while. And that when companies and even more so governments are thinking about how to hedge themselves against a sort of conflict that they don't really often play a major part in between the US and China, and they don't really want to take sides in, one of the things holding them back from participating more in these US de-risking policies is the fact that they're not totally certain that the US will stick the course, and also that the US hasn't really offered them very much to participate. What many of these countries want is greater market access to the US, still by some distance the biggest consumer market in the world, a huge market for Asian goods that they'd like to get greater access to. And it does make me think that it would be a good way to sort of at least signal a sort of long-term intent to engage with Asian allies and friends in the region. I think that the difficulty of that is obviously that you have a US political situation where major trade deals are essentially completely off the menu, basically for both parties, really, but maybe particularly the Republican Party. So it does make encouraging that sort of more positive relationship, I think Caroline described it as the carrot as well as the stick, much more difficult.
Yeah, I agree with all that. It's interesting to me thinking about this in the context of what happened during COVID, when companies realized just how little visibility they had over their supply chains. You know, most companies had a good grasp of their immediate suppliers, or what's called the first tier of their supply chain. But many of the problems that led to snarl-outs were caused by their suppliers' and their suppliers and so on. And you'd have this one factory in China that made some very specific type of glue that was, you know, essential in some other component and so on and so on. And it turned out that companies had all sorts of hidden dependencies like this that had resulted from this incredible fragmentation of their supply chains that had occurred over the last few decades of globalization. And now I think as the West is exploring how to extricate itself from China, I think it's incredibly difficult because somewhere in the supply chain of almost any good, there's bound to be a dependence on China.
Yeah, I think it was really clear from listening to Caroline that the efficacy of decoupling is really unclear. It is very difficult to get a handle on just how much the US has actually been able to extricate itself from China. The clearer impact is the benefit to countries like the Vietnams of the world or other players that have managed to get essentially sort of a toehold in supply chains as a result of these policies. And I realised that at the moment that toehold might be pretty small. It could be as small as them literally just relabeling packages from China and shipping them off to America. But I do wonder whether if this remains the status quo for policy for a while, whether they might be able to sort of expand that footing a little into doing actual steps in the supply chain, even more than they sort of managed to already. Whether or not that achieves any of what the actual sort of goal of the policy was in terms of safeguarding supplies of sensitive stuff or critical minerals and things, that's less clear. But I do feel as though in the early stages of this, the impact that places like Vietnam or other similar countries might have on supply chains will be minimal, but it could expand over time.
So we've been talking about the economics of America's China policy. But listeners, if you're interested in hearing more about the political backdrop for all of this, then you should check out our sister podcast, Checks and Balance. This week, the Checks team is taking an in-depth look at how America's China policy is actually made, what political forces are at work, and where the US approach to China is heading next. It promises to be a fascinating listen.
And if even that isn't enough to sate your voracious appetite for US-China content, then you can keep up to date with all of The Economist's US-China coverage and more for absolutely nothing by going to economist.com/podcast offer for a free 30-day digital subscription. That is, if you're not a subscriber already.
After the break, we'll delve a bit deeper into the small yard, high fence approach to economic ties with China and how it's being applied in the computer chip industry. Before the break, we heard how a small yard, high fence approach is how the Biden administration likes to describe its current de-risking strategy towards China. Select some security-critical sectors and shield them from Chinese influence in the supply chain. Semiconductor chips are up there as probably the single most important product that requires this treatment. To find out more, I spoke to Chris Miller. He's Associate Professor of International History at Tufts University and the author of a new book on the subject, Chip War, The Fight for the World's Most Critical Technology. Chris, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So tell us a little bit about your book, Chip Wars. And I suppose, as well, could you tell us why semiconductors in particular have become such an area of preoccupation in this commercial back and forth between the US and China?
Well, today semiconductors are important economically because they're in almost every type of manufactured good. If you look across the economy, whether it's autos or industry or high-tech, semiconductors are critical to everything. But they're a rare type of manufactured good that China can't produce itself, at least when you're talking about the most types of cutting edge chips. And so China spends as much money each year importing chips as it spends importing oil. And that's something China's leaders want to change. They've been investing billions and billions of dollars a year to domesticate cutting edge chip technology. But right now they're reliant on key trading partners, Taiwan, Korea, the United States, Japan, to import them. And so this struggle to control the future of the chip industry is partly about trade flows and commercial profits, but it's also a political struggle because all the governments in question perceive chips not just as an important trade good, but also as a strategic priority for their defense and intelligence systems.
So the US was once a big producer of chips. Taiwan does a lot of it now. So the American government is making reshoring the chip industry a priority. The CHIPS Act will pour $50 billion into chip R&D and manufacturing over the next decade. The world's largest chip maker, a Taiwanese company called TSMC, is looking to expand in the US as a result of these subsidies. US policy also aims to restrict the transfer of technology from the US to China, like the cutting-edge machine tools used to manufacture chips. What do you make of these reshoring efforts?
First, to put the US efforts in context, they're not alone. Everyone is doing it. But it starts from a pretty strong position across the value chain, because when you look at chip design, the software tools, the machine tools, the US is by far the leader across the value chain. And so there's a lot of pieces with which to build a successful fabrication industry in the US. I think the challenge that the US faces is that it's simply more expensive to build chips in the US than in East Asia. The best studies that have been done have found that it's 20 or 30% more expensive. And so the CHIPS Act is trying to use government incentives to close that cost gap. And incentives are certainly going to do that while they're spent. The question is whether we're going to see further rounds of investment after the incentives stop being provided. And that's very much an open question. It's really not a surprise that companies are deciding to build more factories when they're receiving money to do so. The harder part is building out an ecosystem that makes it commercially viable for companies to keep investing in the US, even if costs are higher in the long run, and they will be. You've got to find a way to convince companies that there are other benefits that justify those higher costs. And that's the key challenge the US faces right now.
So the Biden administration likes to talk in terms of de-risking, about a small yard with a high fence, tight restrictions on some security-related products rather than a wholesale decoupling. Do you think companies are receiving that message, and are you seeing a difference? Or do you think there's a sort of wider decoupling on the way?
Well, I think one of the big analytical mistakes people often make when addressing this subject is to look at it as a US-China dynamic, when in reality, I think if you had to put the order in chronological terms, it would be a China-US dynamic, because it was China that started the decoupling processes in semiconductors before the US. But I am struck by the extent to which in the electronics industry, there are major shifts underway, both at the chip level, but also at the device assembly level. And today, almost all the world's smartphones are assembled in China. The vast majority of PCs are assembled in China. And so even if the chips are made in Taiwan or Korea, they end up in China as part of the assembly process. I think if you look at what companies are doing right now, where they're investing today for the production they want to have in 5 years' time, what you find is that new investment into China has really collapsed. They're building new facilities in Vietnam, in India, in Thailand, in Mexico, but not in China. And that is an effort to begin to bifurcate supply chains. They're going to have a China-focused supply chain for sales in China and a supply chain outside of China for sales outside of China. And that's going to be a very long process. It won't be a complete separation, but basically every company in the electronics industry is trying to reduce their reliance on China for assembly, for component supply, and have a clearer separation between their China and non-China businesses.
So for Asian countries that are physically near China, but for example, with a tight security relationship with the US, I'm thinking particularly of Korea and Japan here, they've got some incentives which tip in favor of seeing Chinese companies as a competitive threat, and some in favor of keeping their own very deep industrial networks going. Those go quite a long way into China. So how do you think that balances out over the longer term?
So I think that every company wants to keep its end market in China. And indeed, governments in Asia, as well as the US government, are supportive of firms trying to continue to sell to Chinese customers, except in very niche high-tech areas. Next to that, companies are realizing that they're facing competition from Chinese competitors. And so every firm in Asia, every multinational that's operating in China is trying to balance those two aspects, limit the capacities of Chinese competitors while maintaining access to the Chinese end market. I think next to that, within Asia, you've got different political views among different governments, which shapes the context in which companies operate. So in Japan, which is doubling defense spending as a share of GDP precisely because they see China as a primary security threat, there's really no doubt where the government stands on this issue. Whereas in Singapore, the government is very open about trying to play both sides off of each other and get the best deal from both Beijing and Washington. So companies from different countries face different domestic politics as well as they try to navigate their business operations in China.
So you're quite right in that comment that people often look at this as a US-China thing, but in fact the decoupling or de-risking in semiconductors certainly started as a Chinese aim. Now the US has responded, you've had the CHIPS Act, you've got the export controls. How does China respond to all of that?
A lot of people are focused on the way China might respond by imposing its own controls on gallium and germanium, which are two materials used in semiconductor production, which are currently dominated by China, and China is announcing restrictions on their export abroad. I think this is actually the less significant Chinese response. More interesting is going to be how does China continue to subsidize its own domestic industries and win market share abroad. And there are two industries right now where China is investing a lot of money, a lot of focus. One is electric vehicles, which are deeply interrelated with the chip industry because of all the semiconductor content in EVs. And we've seen China win really substantial EV market share, especially in Europe over the past year. Second place is in low-end semiconductors, where China does have the capability to produce domestically. And right now, there's huge investment already underway, factories under construction in China in low-end chips. And so a key question over the next couple of years is, as these factories come online, will they win market share in Western markets or not? And if they do start to win market share, I think we should assume there's going to be backlash in advanced economies saying, well, we don't want Chinese firms winning market share when we're in the process of trying to rebuild our own chip industries. And so these are two areas of really substantial trade, Chinese growth and exports, where I think we should expect more trade tension to come over the next couple of years.
So as a last question, could you just give us your view? Do you think de-risking is working? Is there anything that could be done to make it work better?
The big problem with the de-risking framework is that it suggests that the costs of these shifts are going to be low. But to pretend it's cost-free is just naive. It's delusional. And I think there's an impetus from political leaders to play up the fact that it's going to be low cost because their voters, their companies aren't excited about paying higher costs. But the reality is, if you want major shifts in global trade, if you want increasingly to lock out China from key markets, you're going to have to be prepared for costly measures. And that, I think, is the major problem that the de-risking concept faces. It's just not honest about the cost it involves.
Chris Miller, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, Alice, Tom, from what we've heard today, would you rate America's China policy a success so far?
Yeah, I think that question is pretty difficult to answer for many of the reasons that we've touched upon. And I guess as I was sort of listening to this week's show and thinking about the cover story that we ran a few weeks ago on political CEOs and how much they are sort of expressing their policy preferences through their businesses, it's just incredibly hard to figure out how much of this is kind of lip service, really. You know, you hear from a lot of CEOs that they are aware of and understand the sort of decoupling strategy, and that for various reasons they might want to secure their own supply chains. But it is extremely difficult to do. And the point that Chris made at the end there about how costly it's going to be for things like semiconductors, it's kind of clear that there are real trade-offs, our favourite word. There are real trade-offs with all of these kinds of policies. And it's difficult to balance some of the costs and difficulty of extracting your supply chains from China with the perceived benefits or the perception of going along with the way that American policy is sort of blowing. And so, in general, I do think that is a very tricky question to answer. I think if I reflect on where I was at the beginning of the show and now, I think it's probably been less successful than I thought for all of the reasons that you've teased out, in particular, how some of the things like the fall in bilateral trade or fall in investment is probably kind of just smoke and mirrors. But yeah, I think it's very, very challenging to evaluate, but I'm really glad that we've had a go.
I do think there's something to be said about the idea that even if countries like Vietnam and India and Mexico are today only taking on, in some cases, the kind of final stages of assembly in a product, over time, as they become more embedded in supply chains and gain exposure to the production process, they may well be able to take on a greater and greater share of that. I know, for example, in India, the government is asking companies like phone makers and car makers like Tesla that are setting up production in the country to also start making efforts to nurture local component suppliers there as well. So building that depth in the supply chain is going to take some time, but I think it could happen.
Yeah, and I think actually that point gets to the very center of, for me, why this is a big deal and why I think this isn't going as well as those headline figures suggest. If you look at a country like Korea or Taiwan, for example, which their exports are more complex and typically considerably higher up the value chain than China's, unlike sort of Vietnam or India, they don't need the highest value parts in the things they export to come from China. They're usually the source of them themselves, and yet they are also inextricably linked to China. You look at Korea, for example, and it's the supply now of less complex integrated circuits, which are part of what makes up a semiconductor, that Korea relies on China for. This is something that Korean companies used to make, but now Chinese companies do. And you hear Korean policymakers and businessmen sort of worrying about Korea's reliance. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the highest value stuff that creates a sort of difficult reliance and creates supply chain vulnerabilities. And I think for that reason, the problem with this whole policy set is that the language around it is very hazy. There's no economic definition of what de-risking or resilience mean. These are foreign policy words that have been inserted into sort of economic policy. You know, The Economist, we were founded on a position of free trade, but free traders have understood that there are national security arguments against it since the days of Adam Smith, and indeed accepted many of those arguments. I think what's happened with the US is it's gone from having essentially no industrial policy to having an industrial policy that applies to supply chains, even that the US is not directly involved in. So really deep into Asian production networks that the US doesn't play a part in other than buying the final goods. And it's done that at sort of breakneck speed in the space of less than a decade, going from managing almost nothing internationally to managing everything. It would be a little amazing if they got it all right on the first go. What you have now is this patchwork of policies assembled over time. Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor to President Biden, is essentially standing on the shoulders of Robert Lighthizer, who designed a lot of the Trump policies. It remains to be seen on the very strictest de-risking. But as Chris Miller mentioned there, I think that the costs of all of this are not acknowledged often enough. And this is the difficulty of trying to prepare a sort of half-war economy. It's very difficult to policymakers to talk openly about this, but the policies are designed to protect the US at least a little bit in the event of a full military conflict with China. You don't want to run a war economy in peacetime because it's very expensive. So this is an attempt to sort of do it on the cheap, which I think there are some strains in the policy already very, very clear. You've never had this sort of conflict, really, between such economically entwined countries. But I think we can be sure that this isn't going to end anytime soon, because it is really the one thing that basically all US politicians now agree on. But I think with that, It's about all we've got time for. Shall we do our statistics of the week? Who wants to go first?
Yep, I'm happy to kick us off. So my stat of the week is on a completely unrelated topic. My stat is 90%, and that is the annual growth of job ads in the UK on LinkedIn that do not require a degree. Now, that's interesting because LinkedIn jobs are basically all white-collar ones, but quite a few firms like, say, IBM, are really starting to explore how they can tap into a wider talent pool, including people who haven't done a degree, which to me seems both very sensible and very uplifting.
Yes, and if you're interested in learning more about whether or not it's necessary to have a degree, you should tune in to next week's episode, spoiler alert, where we will be tackling that question more head on. But that's a great stat, Tom. Thank you for bringing it to our attention. For my stat of the week this week, I decided to stay on theme with a China-related statistic, and it is 0%, which was the annual inflation rate for China for July. And that was actually a decline of 0.2% month on month. So China is flirting on the brink of deflation, which is kind of mad when you consider the problems that everyone in the rest of the world is having with rampant inflation all over the developed world that is proving pretty tricky to get under control. It seems like the disparity is mostly explained by the differences in COVID stimulus. So in the Western world, people tend to give a lot of stimulus to consumers and businesses and kept monetary policy very easy and also didn't shut down their economies for 3 years. In China, they seem to be struggling with the opposite problem, having essentially locked down for 3 years. But still, you tend to think of the global economy as moving relatively in sync. And so it's sort of mad that we can have basically deflation in one of the world's biggest economies and real problems with torrid inflation everywhere else.
So my statistic of the week is also something that the Chinese economy is having some difficulties with, but it's 21.3%, and it's the urban youth unemployment rate in June. If you find yourself thinking that June is a little bit out of date, you'd rather hear the July figure, then bad news, because you never will. The Chinese National Bureau of Statistics has discontinued the series. Surely a coincidence that June's level was the highest on record of the series. Statisticians work very hard on these things, and sometimes the series just needs tinkering with, needs some methodological change. We'll check in on that again, maybe in a few months, and see if they've worked it out. With that, I'd like to thank our guests, Caroline Freund and Chris Miller.